Hello, my name's Peter Wooding and welcome to Automotive EV Live. The final session for today is breaking the barrier of lack of home charging. And we've four great speakers who will take us step by step through this. Firstly, starting with Josey Wardle from Zero Carbon Fibers, who will set the scene. So it's all yours, Josey. Thank you.
So I've just been asked to start by setting the scene to why we're discussing this problem today. Obviously, if we're going to achieve the net zero greenhouse gas emissions target by 2050, then we're going to need to tackle many thorny transport issues, including car ownership and alternative forms of transport, especially in light of what we've experienced through the COVID nightmare recently. But fundamentally, electric vehicles is a large component of that change. And if we are indeed to end the sales of internal combustion engines by 2035, then we're going to need to enable everyone who still needs to have a car to drive electric within the next 15 years, no less. But unfortunately, around 47% of UK homes are terraces or flats or apartments, which don't necessarily have access to off-street parking. So how do we provide for them? How do we give those drivers the ability to drive and recharge where and when they want without crippling the existing infrastructure in our residential areas? So why is it even an issue? Why are we talking about it today? Well, as you probably all know, the UK's target is that all cars and vans on our roads should be zero emission by 2050. That means basically converting 37 million cars and vans, if we all continue to own as we do today, over to another form of cleaner transport by 2050. No tall, short order there. The government is currently consulting on bringing that ban on new internal combustion engine vehicle sales forward from 2040, which it originally proposed, to 2035 or even sooner. But so far, we've only got about 261,000 ULEVs on our roads today. So a significant change in behaviour is required to enable drivers to change their behaviour so that they can all drive electric or indeed another form of cleaner transport. And fundamentally, electric vehicles require charging facilities to power those vehicles. But those drivers who can't park at home and therefore charge at home have therefore a barrier to adopting EV. So what can we do about this? So first, maybe we should ask, well, what do drivers really want in terms of recharging? And we've been talking to drivers all over the UK and Europe for 10 years or so now at Zero Carbon Futures. So I've just given here a brief summary of what drivers tell us they want. And fundamentally, that's convenience. Really, they want to be able to charge wherever, whenever, and however they want. And that's what gives us the challenge. So there are many ways of achieving this already available. We can charge on streets in residential areas or indeed in many town centres. We can use rapid chargers. We can use rapid chargers now in filling station format, like the fascinating example second down on your screen. And we've got new developments of huge filling stations involving various different types of chargers, right up to 350 kilowatt ultra fast chargers in multiples like 24, like the grid serve example at the bottom that's coming to Braintree in Essex soon. So what drivers want to give that convenience is a mixture of different characteristics. They'd like to see flexibility in where, when, and how they recharge. So where, in terms of near home, they still want to be able to charge near home. Most drivers say they prefer to charge at home, which is why we're having this discussion today. But they also like to charge at work, and they also like to charge in destinations. They like to charge during the day, but they like to charge overnight as well. And therefore, different types of chargers like slow, fast, rapid and ultra rapid are all now available to help them to do just that. But one of the key characteristics that they require is reliability, because poor reliability reduces confidence of EV drivers who've already been confident enough to make the switch, and also it delays adoption further for those who are still a little bit nervous and then see all these chargers with reliability problems around their areas. Chargers need to be accessible. By accessible, we mean not behind physical barriers in car parks, for instance, that are maybe only open 10 hours a day, and barriers in terms of access, in terms of payment cards and access cards as well. And this is very much what the government's current consultation is covering in terms of the consumer experience of using charge points in public places now. Next, they want availability. They want good availability. So fundamentally, they want to be able to access chargers 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, wherever they want, as we've already discussed. But also it's becoming an issue in certain areas that there aren't enough chargers. So for instance, where chargers are installed on streets, where there are now multiple residents driving EV, they want to see more chargers so that they can charge when they want and don't have to wait till the next day when their next door neighbour has finished charging. Then value for money is obviously always very important to people. They do make home energy comparisons, so they're comparing the cost that they're paying for public charging with how much they pay for their electricity at home. But of course, we have to cover the capital cost of installing and maintaining that infrastructure in public places as well. And they do compare the costs of EV driving against the cost of internal combustion engine driving. So we need to be mindful of that ceiling as well. And I've already said it, but fundamentally, the majority of EV drivers still tell us they prefer to charge at home. So hence we have a problem for those who don't have the ability to park and charge at home. So what do drivers feel? Those drivers that can't charge at home, what have they been telling us? So fundamentally, this is just some feedback from EV drivers in the Northeast who've been driving for many years EV now and have managed without being able to park and charge at home on their own property. So the comments that they make to us vary quite significantly, but I pulled these two out because they relate to location and they relate to cost. So fundamentally, a lot of drivers around the Northeast tell us that they think they should be able to park their car and charge it in town centre car parks, which are largely unused overnight. And in small areas, small urban or rural areas, there is quite good proximity to residential areas and town centres. Obviously, that's a more significant problem and challenge in large urban areas with a greater sprawl of residential areas. But a similar approach could be applied. And then in terms of costs, how much are drivers willing to pay for public charging services? We did start in the early days with free charging, and obviously that can't continue forever, but it was there to introduce people to the idea of converting to EV and to demonstrate that it was possible and to raise interest. But drivers are aware that we've been doing that at significant cost in the early days of EV uptake, and they're ready to start paying. Indeed, Ubitricity, that we're going to hear from later on, have already introduced fees for charging, and so have many other operators. Okay, so just a brief introduction to the challenges of alternatives to home charging facilities, which are still very real in all of our towns and cities at the moment. So firstly, I have to mention space constraints. It's still a big issue on many of our streets, both in terms of the availability of parking bays, how many of them, where they are there enough of them, for instance, to cover all the homes on a street? No, there aren't fundamentally. Streetscape problems keep raising their heads. We have a lot of clutter on our streets and planners are very unwilling to add more clutter to that. So different charging solutions might be appropriate to alleviate that. For instance, Ubitricity's lamppost charging solution, but also pop-up chargers, that we see coming to the market now, and the idea of bollards and some of the other things that Oxford are going to talk to us about next. And the last thing there is about distance. So how far are drivers willing to walk from their home to park and charge their car and then go and collect it later on? The second issue is power. How much power we have readily available on our streets, how much capacity there is in that system, especially with the mixture of old and new lamppost infrastructure we've got in, and LED lights and still non-LED lights. And also how that power demand plays in terms of time of use, and whether when we all come home from work at 6 o'clock and plug in our cars, which also coincides with the peak use of energy in our homes, will this cause the grid a major consideration? Next, we come to the business case. So obviously different types of charging facility have different costs of infrastructure and maintenance. We have very many different use cases appearing in the market, from personal users with very low mileage to very high regular mileage users like taxi drivers and freight vehicles coming into the electric sphere. How do we accommodate their various time of charging requirements and location of charging requirements? And then the biggest problem for the business case at the moment is still poor utilisation, because fundamentally we don't have that many plug-in vehicles yet on the roads in the UK. And what we've seen in many parts of the UK is where we've offered parking incentives to encourage people to come into the city centres, for instance, in EVs, we've created a dilemma where people are parking all day for free, but maybe actually only taking charge for an hour or two, effectively blocking that facility for everybody else. So there are some utilisation issues that our incentives have created that we need to sort out in the future. And then the final issue, which is very high on the radar of most local authorities, is this issue of social equality. There is fundamentally a lack of space in our urban areas, and that space could be used for alternative things. So is it right to use it for charging? Also, how do we incentivise people in more deprived areas and not lock them out of changing their transport solution to an electric solution if possible, when the business case in those areas is still pretty poor? And then the final consideration I thought I'd mention here is about prioritisation. And do we need fundamentally to have a system of booking or equivalent, so that those regular high mileage users, where we can save the most emissions quickly, maybe get prioritisation booking services? And how do we roll that out in a fair and equitable manner? So finally, before I hand over to Sam, what about the future? So obviously things are still changing. It's still a very niche market. We've got technology changes in terms of vehicles. We've still got lots of new vehicles coming to market. We've got battery technology changes. We've got range technology changes, and we've got charging technology changes. And therefore, we've got new types of chargers, faster chargers coming to market, but not necessarily all of our vehicles can take that high-speed charge yet. Fundamentally, the vehicle manufacturers their development work is aimed at trying to get the time to recharge down as far as possible, so that we don't see such a big difference between petrol and diesel refueling times and electric recharging times. And then we've got obviously a lot of mobility challenges that are high on people's radar at the moment post the COVID era. We've had much more home working. We now have been encouraging for many years increasing public transport use, but actually there's a nervousness potentially out there about using public transport at the moment in terms of infection. So will we actually see a push back towards more personal car and van use in the months and years to come, because people are fundamentally a bit more nervous? And then whatever happens in those top two items obviously has a knock-on effect again to space, power, and the business case. So I'd like to hand over now to Sam Hampton, who's going to talk about the Oxford experience.
Hey, thank you. Just wait for my slides. Yeah, so thanks very much, Josey. I think you'll see that there is a lot of overlap between what you've just described and what we found in our trial. So our trial ran from 2017 to 2019 and was all around this idea of on-street charging, and so I'm going to talk. I was working at that time for Transport Studies Unit. I'm still at the University of Oxford working on another energy innovation project, and I'm going to hand over at the end of my bit about our academic evaluation to Zara Hassenplug, who's at Oxford City Council. So just a bit of background. So Oxford is a really good place to trial these kind of technologies because we are a dense urban area, relatively small city, relatively dense population. And this picture, you can see that there are lots of roads without front gardens and tight parking space. So, but we also, and another point worth making is that we have affluent neighbourhoods, so there is a lot of suppressed demand for electric vehicles in the city. So there are 40,000 households within the city boundaries without off-street parking, so a real issue. And then other things that are worth mentioning is that Oxford has a very thriving innovation ecosystem. So we have a high degree of capacity within the two local authorities, good track record of electromobility projects, and we also have two universities who have a good record as well. We also have a constrained distribution grid, so the issues around time of use that Josey mentioned are very real and live, and there are different projects going on to look at generating a smart grid for the whole county of Oxfordshire, and also looking at things like private wire networks to allow the charging of electric buses. But so that's what I'm actually working on at the moment, but that's a story for another day. And then finally, we have advanced plans for a zero emission zone, slightly on hold because of COVID at the moment, but very ambitious plans for the city centre to eradicate all vehicle emissions. Okay, so the project is part of the Go Ultra Low Cities Fund, and Oxford City Council were awarded 800,000 for on-street charging trials and rollout, and it included a car club, Co-Wheels, who have quite a big presence in the city, and I'm going to talk to you about phase one, which was the trial of 5 different technologies and 30 chargers. And Sarah is currently working on planning the rollout for an additional 100 chargers based on our learnings from phase one. Okay, so the technologies we trialed, we tried 5 different types, as I mentioned, but in 3 categories. So we looked at lampposts, bollards, and a home charger. At the time, Ubertricity was the only show in town in terms of lampposts for some technical regulatory reasons around metering and unmetered supply. And then with bollards, we trialed 3 different types of bollards. The one in the middle is one produced by a local Oxfordshire firm. So that was a kind of earlier stage of prototype development than the others, and they were included in the project, partly because they were local, and the project was an opportunity for them to learn and develop their systems. And then finally, this kind of low tech solution of digging a duct into the pavement outside somebody's terraced house, and then we would the trial included an installation of a charger on the front of that person's terraced house, and as you can see, they lay the cable to avoid it being a trip hazard. Okay, so what we did in terms of the evaluation, and we felt that this was almost as much of a finding as the results themselves, but we wanted to come up with a set of criteria that could be used for comparing different technologies. So we first thing was to say that there are different perspectives here, and this triangle shows you that there are kind of public concerns, private sector concerns, and then the users, and of course they all interlink, but perhaps the users are a little bit represented in the whole kind of EV transition discourse. So we really wanted to draw attention to what makes a charger useful for a urban resident, and we came up with 8 criteria from the user perspective. So a lot of these chime with what Josey was saying around accessibility, ease of use, the street clutter issue. So how big are they? How much space do they take up? Robustness is really important, and that's slightly different from reliability. Well, I guess there's a real overlap, but the robustness can be the physical robustness as well as the kind of, whether it's functioning. And ease of maintenance and repair. Price paid is important, obviously. The way in which people are told the information and billed, and the speed is obviously important too. But then additional to those, and of course government and private sector care about those 8 criteria because they care about the users, but in addition they care about utilization, how many hours a day the chargers are they used for, and that of course depends on location and that kind of thing. And I was told by one charge point operator that they aim for 3 hours of use a day. That's a kind of break-even figure, and regardless of the speed we're talking about. So that was a useful rule of thumb that I thought I'd share. Adoption capacity. So can other users easily come along and use and plug in? How much do these things generate issues with neighborhoods? How many complaints are issued? And finally, the commercial sustainability is obviously really important for long-term viability. Okay, so I'm just going to go on to the kind of high-level findings. I mean, we've written a 35-page report, which is available for reading, where we have lots and lots of findings. But the overall findings were that lampposts scored best. So the Ubitricity lamppost was very reliable, very easy to use, and rather cheap to install. So mainly because the infrastructure is already there, the electricity connection is already there. In Oxfordshire, we have the Highways Authority has a policy of re-siting lampposts from the curb side to the wall side of the footpath, which is obviously a bit frustrating because that means that you would then need to couple it with some kind of duct or trenching. But that's the kind of headline on the lampposts. They work very well and very popular amongst their users. Bollards are faster. From the user perspective, there is an advantage in that in the trial they were accompanied by dedicated parking bays, but they were more expensive because they needed a new electricity connection, and they were kind of obviously a new installation as well of the unit, and because of the complexity of involving the DNO and having a traffic regulation order and a public consultation, they took longer to install. And then once they were installed, we found that they broke down a lot more frequently than lampposts or home chargers. So for various reasons, like mechanical and electrical failure, or vehicle strike, or vandalism in some cases. And then finally, home chargers were very popular amongst the people who got them. They are obviously a different category because they are private. That they can only really be used by the person whose house it is. But they were great. They were used a lot. They're kind of more high levels of usage than the other technologies. But residents, because we didn't provide a dedicated parking bay as well, people found it quite challenging to get access to parking spaces just outside their house. And there is an open question, given that this is essentially a private asset, whether public money should be going towards this, and some kind of subsidy maybe, but maybe not 100% funding. So that's a very quick run through of our findings, and some of this is these final challenges that Josey's already covered, and Sarah is very much dealing with on a day-to-day basis at the moment. But we kind of wanted to raise 3 main challenges. One is that this kind of constellation of new grid connections, traffic regulation orders, and roadworks equates to more expense, more time delays, and the involvement of multiple organisations. So I think we emphasise that because bollards can sometimes be the kind of default option, and actually we wanted to emphasize that in this case they were accompanied by lots of issues, and like Josey said, we need all different types of technologies. In car parks and destination charges, bollards are the answer for sure, but on street they present some real issues. Second, repair and maintenance, it should not be underestimated. Breakdown can be more frequent, and the longevity of these technologies is probably half what you might expect. in our experience. And the real issue, to be frank, is that the CPOs and the manufacturers, whoever's running these things and making an income, it at the moment, with EV uptake relatively low, the commercial incentive is not really there for them to kind of be sending out engineers all the time to check things are working and then to fix them. And that, of course, is a real issue in terms of public safety, but also, as you said, trust in the infrastructure. It's a real source of frustration and potential barrier to new users. And then finally, something that should be more easy, but getting access to actual charging data in the format and frequency that we wanted can be surprisingly difficult. So for people wanting to kind of evaluate these things and look at their usage, definitely worth thinking very carefully about that and who owns that data and who it can be shared with. Okay, so that's my piece, and I'm just going to hand over to Sarah now. Here's her slide.
Yes, thanks Sam for that. I suppose kind of first thing is to say that kind of while Sam's been representing the research, so has a kind of a very objective view on our charging estate. Kind of, I'm representing the local authority, so we're kind of looking at this in from a slightly different perspective. So kind of taking on this project, we've made a commitment in a sense to our trial participants and to the city overall, to address the issue of our 40,000 households that don't have access to a driveway or off-street parking. But what is really important is this kind of on-street charging itself is only one part of a much bigger puzzle, and that is absolutely critical. And Josey mentioned that at the beginning. So kind of what we're looking at is kind of effectively an EV ecosystem across the city that allows us then to build some resilience into our on-street solution. So we don't anticipate that kind of we achieve perfection in regards to kind of the types of charging we can use on the streets. But what we can do is we can kind of plan out kind of what are the alternatives that are available to those users that are dependent on those. So kind of we're looking at rapids and super rapids. We're building a super rapid charging hub as part of another project that's connected to a battery that kind of allows us to balance the kind of demand on the grid. We're kind of also looking at kind of supporting the private sector to kind of through planning support, so that we can ensure that kind of as the private sector kind of puts in, say, kind of home charging or kind of workplace charging, they have the information they need to do so. And kind of another kind of aspect is kind of to look particularly at those high priority users. So, I mean, Olaf has been very supportive kind of to the kind of taxi and private hire trade, identifying them as a really critical part of the transport puzzle. And we're installing taxi rapid chargers. Kind of first installation has been live for a year nearly now. But they're not the only high priority users. So kind of the care sector, for example, kind of relies on personal vehicles heavily, and it's worth considering as how those sectors are being in particular supported. And kind of Oxfordshire County Council is doing a lot of work around that as well. Kind of I realised in my bullet points, kind of one element that I have missed is that kind of car park overnight charging is something that is also being looked at from kind of the county council perspective in the area. And of course, we're all working together kind of to ensure that kind of all these areas are being addressed. I think for us, kind of what's happening next is considering kind of how on-street would look like at scale. And it's very clear that kind of when we're talking about business as usual of on-street, we actually don't yet know how this looks like once you have hundreds of chargers kind of live. And it's really clear to us kind of from the learnings from phase one is that there needs to be quite, there's still kind of some learning kind of required, in particularly kind of what role kind of a local authority, and in our case a district, kind of what role the kind of our organization plays in the system overall. And anybody that's taking kind of on-street charging forward needs to really kind of be clear kind of what that position is. It's also looking at on-street charging as a service. So kind of some Sam pointed out that kind of in a sense the vagaries of kind of bollard charging, kind of we had issues with vandalism, we have issues with robustness, we had kind of difficulties at times to enforce the SLA, and what it means is that kind of, just relying on the private sector, doing all that work for you is not going to be sufficient. There needs to be an understanding how good contract management looks like. How do you realize the benefits that you're pursuing under the contracts on street reliably, kind of in the long term? The contract duration for on-street charging kind of, is getting longer and longer. So kind of, on the different frameworks that are kind of live at the moment, you kind of look at kind of 8 to 15 years terms on a concession contract, kind of so that, of course, the private sector can recoup their capital investment. If you make a commitment for that period of time, kind of contract management is absolutely critical. And of course, if the local authority owns the asset, then asset management is absolutely critical. What we're also seeing is that from a county council perspective, which is the highways authority in our case, they're looking at kind of what are their quality requirements? What do they need to see to make sure that these chargers are maintained safely? How many electric safety inspections do they need per year? How many visual inspections need to be carried out? Do these chargers need to be cleaned? There's a lot of things to consider. And then the last point is kind of the resilient business case. There's some overlap with realizing contract benefits. But a key finding for us is that the charger, the hardware, is not your primary asset. It's the charging site. It's the investment that you have in that site when you open the ground, when you lay the cabling, when you put the feeder pillars in, or when you set up contractual arrangements, say with, kind of the transport authority in our case, or the supplier, or kind of the maintenance provider. It's that work that's kind of transforming your organization to deliver this type of work, and it's kind of what is actually your EV charging site looking like. It's the TRO, it's the signage, it's the bay markings, all that sort of stuff. But what that also means is that you probably need more revenue than you think to maintain those charges, and that is an issue for local authorities. Because there are capital grants that can be accessed, the kind of OX grants, other and other options. Revenue is not as a standard part of that arrangement, and of course, kind of particularly in post-COVID times, kind of revenue is going to be even more an issue than it is, kind of in a sense, in the austerity setting. So, really understanding kind of what it is that you will need to do and how you keep these charging sites working is absolutely critical, and really drawing out all those costs so that your business case is complete. And what we're finding is that kind of, we're still working through these issues for phase 2, but is that kind of building revenue streams is going to be absolutely critical. And that can be something like kind of the cable channel that we're looking at as a potential self-funded solutions, where residents would pay for their solution. And we did a, kind of really approximate business case, but because home charging is so much cheaper than on-street charging or rapid charging, it means that kind of over less than 2 years, a resident should make that investment back, so have a return on that investment. So I think that is a viable solution. Of course, kind of more problematic and socially deprived areas that needs to be worked through. But there's also kind of considerations is, can you draw revenue from, kind of through parking levies? Can you draw kind of revenue through kind of other means of taxation, or other fees that you could raise, kind of contributions that you could get from a community? Could you get the community to take a stake in a charger, or kind of a couple of chargers on a street? And then kind of to just bring this to a close, collaboration absolutely critical to achieve those revenue streams, maximizing robustness. Really critical to make sure that what you put in place in regards to hardware, that needs to last, it needs to be vandalism proof as much as possible. And then kind of as a last consideration, because the big business case is very challenging, is being really clear that monetary is not the only metric here. Carbon is too, and of course emissions are too. So kind of as you work, through kind of for understanding kind of what your solution looks like is making sure that that those other metrics are being considered alongside kind of the purely monetary business case. And I think that's it from me. We have a final slide with our addresses, email addresses. So we should bring that up. So you're very welcome to get in touch with us with a question. We very much encourage you to read the TSV report that can be found on the Transport Study Unit website of Oxford University. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Could we now hand over to Dan, please?
Certainly. Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Sarah. So hopefully my slides will come up shortly, but ahead of those, I'm Daniel Bentham. I'm the Managing Director at Ubitricity UK, also responsible for activities in France as well. And it's really interesting to hear the challenges posed by Josey and then some of the activities ongoing by Oxford in exploring some of the potential solutions to addressing those challenges. What I'll try and do now is weave in how at Ubitricity we are delivering our own solution and how we think we've got a particular on the UK market in particular. So whenever we think about innovation, at Ubitricity, we try and place a constraint upon our thinking, because whenever there's a necessity, that's the mother of all invention, and we want to try and reduce as much blue sky thinking as possible to try and deliver something for the here and now. And the three constraints we place upon ourselves in the UK are really around working within the existing infrastructure, which is a point made by Josey. Also working in a way which delivers a sustainable business model, so the commerciality of whatever we're doing and the cost base, which we're trying to obviously resolve with any revenues. And then the final one being around consumer behavior and driver behavior. And that's really important because actually it'll be the consumers who decide how they charge their cars and which charge points they use, how many they need in one location, and what they like and don't like. So we try and put all of those elements into our thinking. So in terms of my background, Ubitricity, currently I was previously at EDF, holding a number of roles there, including head of research, looking at energy system design, energy market design, and how do we make the transition to a low carbon future. But I've also been responsible for delivering new business units at EDF and started my career in clean tech technology development as well. So at heart, a research engineer. So the origins of Ubitricity stem back maybe 10, 12 years ago now, but where we are today is quite different. So we are backed by Siemens, Honda, and EDF, so covering the energy system, technology, and automotive parts of our puzzle. We see that we're here to deliver a smart, flexible, low carbon energy system, and we have a very key role to play in that, and I'll discuss a bit more about that in a second. And really the philosophy is that we want to provide electricity to everyone, everywhere. And that goes back to what Josey said at the start, is that people really want to be able to charge whenever and wherever is convenient for them. And what we want to do is to bring that solution to every single car parking space. Every car parking space should have a charge point, in our view. In our future world, this panacea that we're all working towards, that's what we should have. And there's a number of really good reasons to put that infrastructure in place. In terms of how we do that, well, we offer everything at Ubitricity. We design and build our own hardware. We work with partners actually to install that in the UK because there are some technical skills that you require to work on the highways, but we will run the projects. We have our own customer services teams and our own billing teams as well. And on top of those basic CPO or charge point operator functionalities, we also offer data management and insights to help with the strategic planning of charge points and also understand how consumers use charge points now and will use in the future. And then with those constraints on our innovation, we're looking at smart charging, managed charging events, vehicle to grid, where we've had some successful projects, and how all of that fits within the smart cities, smart grid space. And finally, we work with a whole host of different customers. We see ourselves very much like an Uber or an Airbnb. We have our users or our passengers, who are the people who connect to our charge points to charge their vehicles, and then we have the hosts or the drivers, if we were Uber, people who want to host our charge points and provide that utility, that public asset and service to their residents and visitors. So it's come through. So where will you see our charge points? Well, we will put them anywhere on the street or in car parks. We're well known now for our retrofit into lampposts, and we're the only charge point provider that can provide an in-column solution, so there's no external box there. It's very discreet, fits within the streetscape, and it really helps with issues like vandalism, where if you can't see it, you won't try and break it. We also offer a bollard solution as well, which is on the top left-hand side there, connected to the Hyundai. And that's very common now in London and other cities, both on the street and in car parks. And that is something which is becoming more important as we start to look at the spaces between lampposts. And of course, we offer the fairly common wall box, which is the bottom left-hand side there. So we also want to not only want to be anywhere, we want to be everywhere. So we've now breached the 2,000 charge point mark in the UK. We represent over 45-50% of the market in London in terms of number of charge points available to residents. And we also represent over 11% across the UK. And so in the last 18 months in particular, we've built out that portfolio of assets, that network, so that we're now number 2 in the UK, just behind the Polar network. And shortly, we hope to be ahead of them in terms of number of charge points as we are continuing to roll out our charge points across the UK. So I want to spend a bit more time in a moment about what it is about our technology which really then resolves some of those issues. One of those comes down to quality. Because we build and commission in-house, we have a very robust quality process, and so each charge point can be traced back to a component level. So where it was born, it all has a birth certificate, and we can trace that back through the batches if there are any problems, which are very rare. We are open access, so you will see our charge points commonly with the smart cable, which is on the right hand side, and that's purely for our members. If you want to become an Ubitricity member, you can buy a smart cable and get preferential rates. But we have an option for anybody who wants to connect to the charge point on the left-hand side there, using your smartphone, a credit card, and your own standard cable. Anybody can access it. Who do we work with? Well, so we work with lots of local authorities across the UK, including Oxford, as I mentioned earlier, but also with the DNOs, who we've worked with to make them aware of our products and make sure that they are happy for that to connect to their network. And of course, highways engineers who will undertake the work and the maintenance. So part of the future looking element, you hear a lot about smart charging, and a component of smart charging is often considered to be V2G, which is vehicle to grid, and this is where the vehicle itself is capable of exporting that energy back onto the grid as and when the grid needs that energy during a period of constraint, and then the car can then recharge itself at a later date at a low carbon, low price point in the market. And there have been lots of trials in the UK, primarily funded by Innovate UK. Some of those trials actually taking place in Oxford and Oxfordshire as well. And we were part of one of those trials at Ubitricity called V2 Street. And what we did in that project was to demonstrate with an actual car, which had been retrofitted with an inverter, exporting energy or electricity in the form of AC, so alternating current back through one of our lampposts. This is at our office in London, but we did it on the streets of Southwark in South London as well. And we were demonstrating there that actually placing the constraint of working within the existing infrastructure, using the charge points we have today, with a small modification to an EV with the creating an onboard inverter, we can then export electricity very cheaply in terms of the capex that's required, the investments that's required back onto the energy system, which addressed one of the key challenges around V2G, which is the expense of all the additional equipment that you need in order to extract the value from that potential new market. So all the time we're trying to think about how do we work within our existing infrastructure and our existing products. So what makes our charge points a good choice for anybody? Well, they're robust. They are vandal resistant, which was also highlighted in the Oxford report. In fact, they're inherently safe, so it's a sealed unit within the lamppost. We'll also talk a little bit more about some of the other measures that make it safe. Very easy to use for consumers, and harmony. So by that we mean it works in harmony with the streetscape. They will fit within lampposts, within the bollards, every single parking space, and unless you were looking for an Ubitricity charge point, it's quite easy miss them. They're that discreet. So we often encourage people to use the app to try and locate them, which isn't always great in terms of using it as a shop window. So a bit more about the tech itself. So how do we take power from the grid and give that to our customers? Well, our charge points typically have a power rating of 5.5 kilowatts, and that's what we take from our lamppost in the UK. And people are quite surprised by the power rating, actually. So that's faster than what you can take from home in terms of your 3-pin plug, and it's just shy of what you take from a bollard or from a wall box at home through a 7 kilowatt charger. We have a 10-year minimum operating life with a 3-year warranty, and in terms of the maintenance, it is very low with some periodic electrical inspections for electrical safety. Then we talk about the vandalism, which we've spoken about before. Again, this is from that report, so sorry, Sam, for taking this from your report, but it's a really good slide to use. If you put something on the street which is new and shiny, it will attract attention, and it's not always good attention, and it's not always attention that you want. So making things which fit within the existing look and feel of the street actually not only reassures residents that we're not polluting their street with something which is quite ugly, but also reduces the amount of street clutter and also reduces the incidences of potential vandalism as well. So this is something I wanted to share with you as well around our bollard solution. You'll notice that none of our bollards have any protective barriers around them to stop impacts. That's because we've taken a bollard which is commonly used in the UK from a street furniture manufacturer, the leading manufacturer in the UK, and it's actually passive safe. And what that means is that it's been designed to take impact from motor vehicles, from cyclists, from pedestrians even, and to not only reduce the amount of damage to the bollard itself and to the street, so it can be struck by a moving car, self-right, and there's no issues in terms of having to go out immediately and put that right in terms of tarmac issues or curbside issues. But actually, if you strike that bollard here on the bottom part of the slide with your head, you're less likely to suffer a severe injury or death compared to actually striking any other form of street furniture, such as a steel column lamppost or even a steel EV bollard. And that's a safety rating there, which is commonly used. So it's something else to consider when you are putting things on the street, to make sure that they not only look right and they are convenient, but they are inherently safe. We're easy to find using the app, not so easy if you're just looking for us on the street, because we are so discreet. And then the other points is around the pay-as-you-go and the member. And this is something I want to just dwell on a little bit, because this is another layer of innovation which we're going to see more of in the UK as people want to have that ease of access to charge points. So currently we have two payment methods. One is pay-as-you-go on the left-hand side. You use your smartphone, you scan the QR code, enter a credit card detail, use your own standard cable and pay, and you only pay for that event. Or you become a member, you have monthly bills, monthly invoicing, and you purchase the smart cable. Going forward, we're going to digitize the smart cable so it becomes an app, and it becomes another way that other providers can actually give access to our infrastructure. Because of the timescales that are involved, 8-15 years, as Sarah mentioned, for somebody to always want to buy that benefit, that service from Ubitricity, is actually quite limiting. What we want to do is to open that up to other organizations, local authorities themselves, other companies who can then offer other benefits to consumers whilst they're parked there for long periods of time, and take greater value from that. And then the final point, which I'll move on to before stopping, is around the question around people connecting to charge points and charging for a very short period of time, but remaining parked for a long period of time. And that's something that we see on our network. So typically our customers park between 10 and 12 hours on the charge point, and they take power for maybe 3 or 4 hours. And other charge point companies would want to actively encourage those EV drivers to move away, to move on, park somewhere else, and to free up that charge point for another driver. And actually what we're seeing, and a philosophy which we're adopting, is that we should actually leave those customers alone. We want to encourage every customer to connect to the electricity system for as long as possible. And the reason for that, an EV which is disconnected from the system is a stranded asset. You cannot offer smart charging, you cannot offer managed charging events, and you cannot look to the future around vehicle to grid or any other ancillary services because they're disconnected. And that means that the consumers lose out in terms of the cost. So there are periods of the day when power is very cheap, or even you'd be paid to take power. And there are also periods of the day when carbon is very low carbon intensity. And those are the periods when we really want to actively encourage the charging of vehicles to make the most of our renewables, make the most of our low cost electricity, and to encourage the further adoption of low carbon generation going forward. So that's the ecosystem that we're looking to build out, but placing those constraints on our innovation to make sure it's something we can deliver today. And I think that's where I'll leave it, actually, Peter, if that's okay.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for all the presentations. If you don't mind, before you go into the sort of discussion element, as we've had a number of questions in from the beginning, the first question was from Achim Glass in Switzerland, so you're not just being listened to really over here. But Achim's question is based on your presentation, Josey. Convenience is what the consumers want. How has this been verified? Is it interviews or polls? And could you explain a little bit more?
Okay, so we've been running surveys with EV drivers for many years, but we've also backed that up with some in-depth interviews where we're talking to drivers who've been driving for EV for a long time to see how their attitudes and behaviours and thoughts about the future are changing. And it's those drivers that are stressing the convenience point because they still report concerns about lower range, inaccessible charge points, unreliable charge points. And of course, those drivers who don't have the ability to park and charge at home are most constrained by those situations. So it's very much the drivers telling us that what they want is convenience.
Okay, thank you. Second question from a lady, Emma Turner. We've got a bit of back noise, but the lady says, we rent in a heavily congested area in Greater London. There are few on-street charging points available in my area, let alone our street. I can never guarantee being able to park in the same space twice. What options do we have, or is it just a waiting game? To anyone, really.
So I could give a response to that, Peter, if that's helpful.
Okay.
So London is our primary market in the UK. Of the 2,000 charge points that we've installed across the UK, about 1,800 are in London. There are many local authorities or local boroughs in London which are really pushing forward with this technology. So I'm not sure which borough this lady lives in, but if it's one of those, there will be some charge points close by. And those boroughs are continuing to install more of these charge points so that every street will have one or two or maybe more charge points going forward. If she would like to consider an EV, and this is a barrier, she should certainly speak to her local her local borough. Many of them have a mailbox to submit a request, and a lot of the strategy adopted by the local authorities to date has been to look at those requests, to prioritise those, and to install 1, 2, 3 chargers close to those residents so that they have access as early adopters to EVs. For us, it is a short-term problem. So one road in London, Sutherland Avenue, for instance, we've retrofitted all the lampposts on that road. There's 24 EV chargers on one road. So for that road, there's only 72 parking spaces, and all of them are in reach of an electricity charger. So in essence, if you park on that street, you can charge your EV. Now, that isn't everywhere at the moment. That's just that road. But we're doing the same on Liverpool Road in North London, and there's lots of roads now where we are looking at every single lamppost and the spaces in between.
Thank you. One further question from Achim Glass relates more Oxford. With regards to the installation of rapid and super rapid charging stations in Oxford, do you have any experience on how to master the physical logistics for the multiple components for the charging stations so that they arrive on site when the technician actually requires the material to complete the installation?
Peter, I mean, I can say a little bit to this, but I think that question is too technical, really.
Okay.
For me to answer, I'm not quite sure if anybody else has that kind of technical exposure. I mean, it's we're saying that at the moment there's an issue with supply in general in regards to equipment, but we would expect kind of our suppliers to manage this at the required standards, and ensure that this is done.
I think what they're meaning more is that, a little bit like a vehicle production line, do you sync to get the delivery from a logistics perspective of the material you need to install at the same time as a technician's ready to install it, rather than them arriving and then standing and there's no technician for a day or however long it is? That was the point I think that they're making.
Peter, if I may jump in there, we've installed or project managed the installation of over 1,000, nearly 1,500 charge points of all different types all over the UK. And that's one of the things that we've learnt. And what we tend to do is to break down deployment into various stages. So we'll do the groundworks and the cabling work in one phase, and then we'll have the charge point delivered to load into the ground mount. For instance, if it's a ground mount solution or a wall mount solution, when the engineer is there to commission it, so that we don't have lots of waiting time and people standing around. But from the consumer's point of view, they can see something's happening, they can see progress, because it's not always possible to do everything in one go, in our experience.
Okay. I've got another couple, if you don't mind. This is from a gentleman, Andy Dixon. Hi, panel. Is there a danger that we are going to see next level charging options in the near future, or a change to battery technology that might well end up making the current infrastructure outdated? And he was also very surprised that vandalism is such an issue. So any thoughts on that?
Well, I could add something. So obviously, vehicle technology, yes, it's changing. Charging technology is trying to get faster, but fundamentally, it's about how frequently and how often people want to recharge. It's back to that convenience point. So we see from talking to drivers that the convenience point is everything, in that since their car is parked anyway for a long period of time, they're happy to recharge it then. Emergency recharging, when things happen and you need a much more speedy resolution to get you on your way, then yes, there's also solutions and facilities available for that. But it still comes down to how far people drive as to how much energy they need, not whether the charging facilities are faster or higher power solutions are available. So it's down to how many miles we drive, which we need to be reducing. We need to be changing our personal driving habits. And therefore the amount of energy that we need and the best way to deliver it.
Yeah. I think it's probably also worth saying that that's something that we call kind of innovation paralysis. So of course, this is a very fast moving sector and things will change, and none of us, knows with any certainty kind of what this is going to look like in 10 years, but that doesn't mean we can wait for that change to happen. So we do have EV drivers now. We have, people we have a demand that is unfulfilled because the charging solutions aren't there currently where they're needed. So we need to move with kind of what we know now. And we need to hedge to a degree, by, in a sense, looking at different solutions simultaneously. We're reducing the risk that we're doing something that is totally outdated. I think what is worth thinking about is that the need for capital investment to a degree it drives the length of contracts and on concession contracts, and that could be problematic in that sector, that it locks us in, and ultimately then funding is not available to change the technology when that is required. So I think there's some thinking needed again around the business in that area.
And could I just add one thing, which is that I think one of the things we're going to see is larger batteries, 60 kilowatt hours of standard and larger ranges. And I think that the question is a very good one, because I think that does threaten perhaps the business models of some of the destination chargers. If you don't need to charge at the supermarket or the cinema because actually you've got a 400-mile range, but for on-street charging, I don't think it really is a threat. I mean, Dan might have an opinion about this, but people actually, there is a real need for slow charging, overnight charging, those kinds of things. So I think in this particular context, the kind of some of those technological innovations won't kind of be too disruptive.
Absolutely, I'd come back, Sam, and also Sarah as well. It seems to me that most of the risk is in the business model at the moment. Do we have the right business models which are sustainable for the 10, 15-year term, which we do need to have this critical public infrastructure? And you do get a little bit worried when you hear about these companies that need so much utilization to justify their existence, and perhaps maintenance is being delayed because they haven't got the revenue stream coming in. And those are the stories you just don't want at this stage. Battery size is going to increase. And to give you an idea, if an LEVC taxi went up from a 23 kilowatt hour battery to something closer to 40, it wouldn't have to then recharge in London. It would be able to drive from their home into London, do their day's work, and go back again and recharge. And I think coupling larger batteries with shorter journeys and having low cost home or street charging will play a predominant role in charging going forward.
Thank you. One extra, Dan Purcell. Hi, everyone. Interesting points. Do you think there is a clear enough strategy from the government in support of on-street and residential charging solutions, considering this is the primary source for most EV owners? Or is the government expecting local government to just get on with it? They would like to hear it also if there are any issues with component supply.
I mean, I could say something to the first part of the question, less to the latter. I mean, I can just say, kind of from our perspective as a kind of authority, kind of none of the work that we've been doing we would be able to do kind of without the emission vehicles, which are the kind of the capital funder, kind of for kind of both of our goal project. And of course, there's also kind of this research then kind of in a sense informs the government strategy going forward. I think kind of the only concern that I would continue to raise is that it's the revenue requirement for making these solutions work. And I think that is an unresolved question. Who pays ultimately? Who pays for the capital, of course, is also a question that is to a degree unresolved. But who picks up costs? And I think that does need more work. I think that question will continue to change as well and require different answers in different circumstances. Kind of the government is engaging quite closely, very closely with us on these issues.
One little anecdote which might be helpful is just to think that, as we know, there is a grant for people who have off-street parking to get home chargers to subsidise that. And one of the things that Sarah and I presented to OLEV was a kind of small lobbying piece, which was to take our home charging and gully solution and actually say to them, look, why don't you extend your grant scheme to something like that? Because at the moment, as I raised in my presentation, I don't think that it really makes sense for that kind of solution to fall to local authorities, because it's essentially a private asset. So the government were very receptive to that, and we think they're working on it. So I think they are really, and their message to us was this is the next big thing for them. They're really prioritising this. And so they funded obviously some trials, and Oxford was lucky to be one of those, but they are taking very seriously the idea that they need to roll this out, either through subsidies, direct grants to local authorities, different options.
Thank you. Are you equipped, Dan, to answer the second part, if there's any issues with component supply?
So we're not experiencing any issues around component supply, but where component supply is an issue, it tends to be lack of planning, or the fact that you are building out some piece of technology which is quite niche or quite new, or is delivered in quite small volumes. So big infrastructure projects, for instance, you have long lead time for any component that you're making and then deploying. Where you work in a space which is more around consumer electronics, a 5.5 kilowatt hour, 5.5 kilowatt charger, for instance, is a plug socket and meter with some electrical components. These are everyday components which are assembled in a certain way and deployed. And it's about placing that constraint upon your innovation. Work within the constraints that you have today, and that means that you have a robust mass market product. If you start being a little bit blue sky and innovating a little bit far out from that, then you have to be prepared for those risks that you're inherently building into your supply chain.
If I could finish with this one, because we're losing your opportunity for a bigger discussion as we've actually gone over already. But the final question was from a John York. What's the average cost and time taken to get the on-street chargers back up and running after a breakdown, and who picks up the cost?
So I could talk a bit about that. Okay. If that's helpful. So very quickly, it depends on the commercial contract you have in place with the local authority. But working in London, there are maintenance contracts in place. And so if we have a call out, they can be as quick as 2-hour call out time that we need to attend in, or it can be 24 hours. And if it's part of the SLA and within the scope of the contract, then it's ultimately the contractor which picks up that cost. And this comes down again to the business model and the contracting terms that you form with the local authority, having a trusted partner, and having a solution which requires little maintenance and is less likely to break down or be vandalized, would be my advice to reducing those call outs.
Okay. Thank you. Josey, sorry that you seem to overrun quite a bit, but any sort of questions that you wanted to run?
Yeah, why don't I just take one of the questions that I thought that would be useful for us to debate, because we've got some quite different perspectives here on the panel, haven't we? And I think probably the best one to go for then is this idea of whether bays on streets, parking bays that are going to be used for charging on streets, need to be reserved for EVs only. Because interestingly, or not, as the case may be, interestingly, you've got some very different experience between Oxford and the wider Ubitricity experience here. And I just wondered what your thoughts were, especially in terms of if you're going with the home charger and the gully solution, then obviously the driver needs to be able to park there to charge outside his own house. What is your experience of TROs and trying to make bays EV only, and lack of demand and other residents' objections maybe to that?
Yeah, I think Sam, you're probably better placed to answer that.
Yeah,
but I can comment afterwards.
Okay, so yeah, we covered this a lot in our trial, and I was told as a relative newcomer to these kind of rules that by various people that TROs are a nightmare, should be avoided at all costs, and that is. From local authority point of view, but also the installers, they add time, but of course they are a feature of democratic accountability, and they're a really important opportunity for local residents to have their say. We did some analysis on the consultation responses, and they were each bay had several responses, some supportive actually, about just under 50% of the comments were supportive, and then of the negative ones, nearly all of them were cited parking pressures. So they how parking is already tight in our area. How could we possibly? You're effectively taking a parking spot away, which is not quite true, because obviously the idea is that there will be a car using it a lot of the time. So yeah, I think it depends on the technology. In Oxford, there was a very clear decision from the county and the city council that only bollards should have them, and that was partly because they were more expensive, and so we needed to guarantee that access could be got, and therefore the bollards didn't have any barriers to utilisation. the Ubertricity solution, because it was cheaper, for every location we were able to install to retrofit 3 lampposts, and so it was deemed that you didn't need a dedicated parking bay because access wasn't going to be such an issue. So that it's good news from Dan's perspective. And then the home gullies, well, I just don't think we have the space, because if everyone wanted a dedicated parking bay in front of their house, there are just more cars than there are spaces in most neighborhoods. So you're really going down a very problematic route. And then of course it's that question of giving an advantage, and there are lots of public accountability questions, and Oxford just decided that was not something it wanted to tackle. But actually we kind of noticed that neighbours started to talk a bit more, to negotiate about parking, and actually that's no bad thing. And some of them we know kind of created WhatsApp groups and things like that to talk about getting access. And again, that we've seen that in COVID, haven't we, in the lockdown, that neighbours are starting to talk to each other a bit more. And actually, in terms of the health of our neighbourhoods, we thought that was a good thing.
Yeah. I mean, I think what I could kind of maybe add to this is that kind of for the cable channels, I mean, again, kind of decisions haven't been taken, but kind of my view on this would be very much not to provide EV bays with the cable channel, and that's partly because if you have a kind of a home charger, if you have the average vehicle usage in the UK, you only need to charge twice a week, and it would be crazy to reserve that bay for 7 days a week if you only need to charge twice a week. So kind of and again, some neighborly negotiations I think kind of can be expected in that context. It's slightly different with a bollard solution that's fully public, or a lamppost solution that's fully public, because while kind of lamppost solutions are substantially cheaper, we also know that for us the business case still is extremely challenging to pay for those, which means we need to make sure that utilization is maximized as much as possible. In particular, if that's our income stream, so if we have a revenue share, for example. And so with that in mind, kind of if where we are currently, although again the full decision hasn't been taken, we would potentially pursue TROs on a much more kind of wider scale than we did initially. We would also potentially look at the voluntary TROs that the TSU kind of recommended in their report, which is TSU. It's an EV bay that is not enforced, so you don't need a TRO process, but you still end up with a bay. So that's an option we could consider as well. And there seems to be, in the general population, more tolerance as there is more EVs and more people want to buy an EV. There is then obviously more tolerance for EV bays in a street.
Dan, do you have particularly anything to add to that, because you've obviously seen it from both sides in London?
We do have some local authorities who have actually installed our charge points in dedicated bays. So they've gone for the low cost option plus added cost by going through a dedicated bay. And where we see that dedicated bays work well is when you've got a small number of charge points being deployed in a community where there's a small number of EVs. So you want to make sure that small community of EV drivers have access to those charge points. As soon as you get beyond the first, let's say, 10, 15 charge points within that community, and beyond the first 5, 10 EV drivers, then you don't really want to be looking at dedicated bays, because ultimately you're tying up your streets, you're expending more money, you could be spending that money on more charge points, and eventually we're aiming for this world where most people, if not all people, will be driving an EV and not an internal combustion engine. So dedicated bays are very much a bit of a stopgap, and quite quickly local authorities are accelerating away from that if they're deploying charge points at scale. And another piece to mention is that our top performing charge points in terms of the utilization are not dedicated bays. They're just bays outside of a home where somebody's got an EV. So it's the presence of an EV driver which gives you your utilization, not a dedicated bay.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Super. Is that okay, Peter?
That's absolutely wonderful, and thanks to all of you. I thought that was a really good session, and quite frankly, despite the fact we're all sat with a laptop or whatever on, not in my case, not such a comfortable seat. There's a lot more comfortable in the office, but it was a really super session, so really appreciate it. Thank you. And keep safe, and we'll look forward to discussing further. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks
you.
for having us. Thanks.
Bye.
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 Thank you, everyone. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.